inviting me. I mean, it's wonderful to be part of this international conference, online conference. Everything's online, so it's great that it's actually possible. I'm a passionate amateur, so I'm not an academic. I'm a medical doctor in the field of public health, and I've been in love with bookplates since 1985 or so. You don't have to read all of this, but this is the sort of chronology of Australian bookplates, and I've been rather cheeky by mentioning as we do that the people, Australia's been continuously settled by our original settlers for 60,000 years. But bookplates, of course, were introduced to Australia by the British when they claimed the eastern side of Australia, thinking that there was no one there, and the first fleet arrived with some convicts in 1788. So the important point here, and I'll come to the details so you don't have to memorize what's on this slide, the first bookplate made in Australia, and it was then just the colony of New South Wales, was made in 1818 by a convict, an artist convict who was probably here because he was forging banknotes or something, and it was an excellent artist. So that's the image you see on the right there. Bookplates in Australia follow the British tradition, very much about bookplates as things that we should be sticking into books to mark ownership, and there's not really much of the sort of small graphics tradition that I know is prevalent in much of the rest of the world. Bookplates, the collecting of bookplates began in sort of the British chronology, from gentlemen and ladies collecting coats of arms and crests into albums, and there were albums made specifically for this purpose. So this is just a crest album that I happen to have acquired and put together by a gentleman from Melbourne in the late Victorian period. Interest in bookplates really took off in the 1890s in Britain and was transferred to Australia. So the Ekslibris Society was founded in London in 1891. There was an outpouring of books about bookplates. There were a small number of Australians who actually joined the Ekslibris Society. Those of you interested in art from the 1890s recognize the importance of the Studio magazine in promoting the Art Nouveau style, I guess. And the editor of the Studio magazine was very heavily into bookplates, and they revolutionized bookplates. So instead of one having to be a very rich person who could afford an engraved bookplate with his or her coat of arms, bookplates suddenly became affordable because any artist could dash off a design in pen and ink and have it printed around the corner at the local print shop. So that made a huge difference. And most bookplates had been armorial up to that time, and then 120, 130 years ago, bookplates became much more available and affordable and democratic. There was one Australian gentleman who I've named the father of Australian bookplates because he began to collect armorial bookplates in the 1870s and 1880s. He joined the Ekslibris Society and commissioned the first pictorial Australian bookplate, which is on the right. So that's him. You probably can't see very well, a library scene, and he's still got his coat of arms down the bottom, but that's the first pictorial bookplate. And so in Australia, there was bookplate collecting interest from the 1890s up to the First World War, and very much bookplates were in many in the sort of Art Nouveau sort of style. There were no societies at that stage, and bookplate displays were parts of other much bigger events, like art competitions or even library conferences. I don't have many pictures in this presentation, unfortunately, but these are just a small number of bookplates from that period, 1890s up to the First World War. Some very famous Australian artists, Norman Lindsay, probably the most famous, and maybe even known internationally. There was a real golden age in bookplate collecting between the world wars. There are a whole number of influences that led to that. There was this rising interest in printmaking, etching, wood engraving, lino cut, which was occurring in England particularly and in Europe, and arrived in Australia. And at the same time, there were strong networks of art teachers, art patrons, designers, and John Lane Mullins, who was very well connected in Sydney society, was also a patron of artists and commissioned many Australian artists to design bookplates, sometimes only one or two, but some had a long series of bookplates. Another famous gentleman, Neville Barnett, also commissioned or arranged bookplate commissions from artists and produced some spectacular privately printed or fine press editions on bookplates. So this was focused on Sydney, but activity also occurred in other parts of Australia, particularly Melbourne and South Australia. The Australian Ekslibris Society was formed in 1923 following an exhibition that was opened by the wife of the New South Wales governor. So undoubtedly, again, John Lane Mullins, with his connections, was able to get this sort of patronage for the first proper bookplate exhibition in Sydney. The society lasted 16 years and basically faded out when Lane Mullins died and the war came along. There were quite a lot of happenings, reports, meetings, talks, branches formed everywhere, including in New Zealand. And in fact, it became bookplate, having a bookplate, particularly by a well-known artist, actually became the height of fashion. So you didn't even, I know there's a story of someone who had a library, actually hated books, but had a bookplate commissioned because it just became very fashionable. The connections that these people had enabled, bookplates were given to visiting British royalty. There was, so they got articles in all the newspapers, and bookplates became very visible. These are some of the bookplate designers from that period. Lionel Lindsay with a famous story about Dr. Johnson, and just other beautiful bookplates. Perrottet, Adrian Faint, and Harold Byrne. These people actually were known internationally. Just very briefly, there were two other bookplate associations that existed this period. One was a breakaway group that couldn't stand the sort of commercializing influence of Neville Barnett, and one of the Sydney newspapers found it quite a joke that they were mounting, this is in the middle of the Depression, of course, mounting a bookplate competition with prize money of £41, you know, as a joke to eliminate the Great Depression. This group published a few documents, a few booklets, which are very nice, but I guess people gave up. They didn't raise the money they wanted to, and people rejoined the original society. The other activity at this time was the Australian Bookplate Club that was formed in Melbourne and issued various newsletters and had a number of booklets and beautiful artists working for them. It formed after the death of Lane Mullins and the fading away of the Ekslibris Society, but again, in the middle of the war, lasted a couple of years. So I'm moving on now to the late 20th century. In the 1970s, we had some very important art patrons, Pat Corrigan in Sydney and John Gardner in Melbourne, who started commissioning book plates, particularly by Australian artists, but John Gardner had an international reach and commissioned over many years a lot of European bookplate artists. As well, we have a gentleman, Robert Littlewood, who has written a number of monographs about bookplates. And I've been involved in writing things about bookplates with the Book Collectors Society and some other members. In the 21st century, these are some recent bookplates just to break up my discussion. Bookplates designed by members of the New Australian Bookplate Society in the last 10 or 15 years, and using many techniques, computer design, wood engraving, and hand painting. There's been Andrew Peake in Adelaide has been publishing bookplate books since 2001. In 2006, an artist friend and I established the New Australian Bookplate Society, and we've been trying to connect with the scattered community of bookplate artists, across the country. I find, and many probably do, that there are many artists that know about bookplates and have designed one or two for themselves, or friends or lovers or family. As well, the Keith Wingrove Memorial Trust in Melbourne, which grew out of the original Australian Bookplate Society, has been mounting Australian and then international bookplate competitions, since 2013, has now been supporting competitions at the cancelled 2020 FISA Congress, and will be supporting the bookplate competition at the 2022 San Francisco Congress. Our society's been working on a smaller scale. We've had an exhibition, we've done a bookplate design award for tertiary students, and we're just trying to work away connecting bookplate designers and bookplate lovers, but it's a slow process. A couple of years ago, the Society was gifted an important bookplate collection gathered by a famous Australian artist and bookplate designer. And we've put a small amount of money into actually conserving the albums with those bookplates. So we've moved sort of into conservation. I just love these. So I collect any sort of bookplate, and these are actually unique, hand-painted, I guess we can't call them bookplates in the nomenclature that the English use. Ekslibris is a more general term, and so you can, if someone paints a design into the front of the book, then that's still called an Ekslibris. And I show them here because I just love them. And but they present a problem, of course, in finding them in the first place. There's one of them in a book somewhere in the millions and millions of books scattered around book fairs and other sort of sales of old books. And they're beautiful when you find them, but hard to know what to do with them. But I guess as the theme of the conference is a little bit about issues and problems in graphics, I just got a couple of slides here where I'm just going over. I've gone over in my mind what I think the issues are locally. And again, bearing in mind, I'm coming from the perspective of a pure amateur who's been a lover of bookplates for 35 years, doesn't have real connections with or is building relationships with institutions, but not professional ones by any means. And so just the points that I've got here on the next two slides, we think we probably know a number of people have written to libraries and universities and so on over the last 20 years or 30 years, trying to identify the major bookplate collections. So I think that's more or less done. But actually finding the documentation of those institutional bookplate collections, apart from the fact they exist, is a challenge. And I think, you know, keeping on reminding people of the beauty and the value and the provenance value of bookplates is an important thing. One of the major university libraries, which had an important collection, had all the images online at one point, and then I presume copyright issues came along and that's no longer maintained. So funding is always a problem. Having images online is really important, of course, for a visual art form. Society, we're building relationships with institutions, but that's just a time-consuming job. And I'm not sure whether institutions are interested in their bookplate collections. There are private collectors we know exist, but don't have any contact with the organizations. And so how to identify private collectors is another question. And I guess obviously a task for local societies, but again, all these things are time consuming. We also would like to, or are, but need to collaborate more with artists, art societies, printmaking groups to promote bookplates, but also document their activities, their workshops, their collections, their writings. Identification of bookplates are not in collections, so it's easy to talk about bookplates that have been swapped between collectors and have ended up in important institutional collections and private collections. Andrew Peake in Adelaide, whom I mentioned, in 2001, prepared a register of Australian personal bookplates. Whenever one goes to a book fair, I find bookplates that, you know, that people have used as bookplates and that they didn't use to swap and be part of societies. So we need passionate searchers of bookplates like myself. It's possible, I'm sure, to mount some collaborative academic projects, and I think provenance has been neglected quite a lot, particularly here, and I think many institutions just starting to recognise the importance of provenance in their book collections, and so bookplates are important. There have been donations of bookplates created for competitions to institutions, so that's a good thing. That's only a recent thing. Both our society and the Keith Wingrove Memorial Trust's competitions have sets that are donated to significant institutions. I've had background projects in documentation of things to do with bookplates in Australia, running annotated bibliography and been preparing a listing of Australian bookplate exhibitions and displays starting in 1898. So that's an interesting field and relies now largely on the fact that many of the newspapers are available online through the National Library of Australia. I think I just added this as I was listening to a presentation. Bookplates in Australia generally considers functional objects, and we don't have that small graphics tradition that is evident in many other places. And so it's probably a function of the small size of bookplates that they get tucked away and not even catalogued in many places. So I suppose my question, you as professional people working in this field and reflecting back on myself, we probably do need to initiate some more substantial conversations with institutions about identifying, documenting, making available and conserving their bookplate collections. So I think that's all for me, and I might have raced through it. I hope I haven't. I would have liked to have shown more pictures, but thank you very much.